Come sapete, ormai...
Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, as it's already been said by many newspapers, one of the most interesting highlights of this meeting has been the exhibition on the financial crisis, the job, the employment, starting from the Bocconi Catholic University students. We reviewed the economic crisis by providing a sort of judgment. The exhibition has been quite interesting, has generated quite a lot of food for thought. Well, trying to understand what happens with those people who want to shut down their companies. We at least wanted to provide a sort of feedback. We wanted in our meetings in these sessions to show what is the world going through with the economic crisis and after the economic crisis. We spoke about the banking system impact. We had people such as Mussari. We spoke about the real economy and the life of finance with Geronte and Mrs. Marcegaglia. We spoke about a huge industrial project concerning real economy. Today's meeting is a sort of summary, a sort of highlights where we wanted to understand what is this crisis leading to, what is the new approach, the new conception, what are the changes being brought about in the overall theory, profile and approach. That's why we thought it was right to have three major speakers who can mirror this sort of summary. Ettore Gotti Tedeschi is the president of IOR is a great economist from the theoretical viewpoint. We even saw it yesterday on Corriere della Sera, speaking about an important essay in an article published to pave the way for this meeting. A round of applause for him, to thank him for being with us. Then Phillip Blond, we met him some years ago when he was so well known at world level because he was in the team of John Milbank. We became friends with him. Over the past years, he starts, we know, from a philosophical viewpoint leading to economy. He started cooperating with the Cameron team. He wrote the operational plan for Cameron, and he's the director of ResPublica on the change of the English-British political world, going from liberalism to other important issues and topics that can be very interesting for us. We thank him again for being with us. And last but not least, Ferruccio de Bortoli. He is the Chief Director of Corriere della Sera and Sole 24 Ore. He's also a journalist. He's not just an editor. He, with his synthesis on economic and political lives, can guide, has been guiding over the past years throughout his career, the Italian civil life towards tolerance, pluralism and progress approach. It is a great honor for us to have him as a guest for the contribution he is going to provide us with. I think it is the case to give the floor to the first speaker. Now, Mr. Gotti Tedeschi has the floor. I'm going to deal with an issue in a very practical way. It is something which is not usually dealt with by economists because people think that it deals with the moral. It has a moral approach, while many think that many instruments such as economy will have to start from moral. If someone speaks about a moral approach, they are really blamed, condemned. I've been working on the economic crisis for some months now, and I've done that also to provide some advice and suggestions concerning also the encyclical. I've studied it in depth, even though the problem of the birth of children has been a problem for some years now. So I'd like to start by making an example. I worked for some years in McKinsey in the United States. I was a consultant, and the year I left, they organized a big party, and the big boss said in front of all the guests there, Ettore has the number of children which we have as number of wives. So he has as many children as many wives we have. Actually, I only had 3 children. Now I have 5 children, and I try to stick to the structure Vittadini suggested. The conception of economy before, during, and after the economic crisis. I'm going to speak about the time before the economic crisis, trying to explain how the economic crisis came up for the during period of the economic crisis. I'll try and explain to you what my interpretation is for what happened because of the crisis, and which everybody considers to be the origin of the crisis. Any economist, banker or politician to whom you may ask what is the cause of the economic crisis, they are going to speak about the lack of rules, regulations, the greedy way of being of bankers, and the improper use of financial tools. While I'm going to speak about something else, I'm going to ask you why financial tools were not properly used. This is my question. Why did we have to progressively speed up the growth of GDP in the Western world with debts to offset what? To compensate what? What was the need for the subprime mortgages? What was the need that led to double the exposure of family debts in the United States? Well, this is my starting point. This is where I'm going to start from. And I'm going to tell you what was the collapse of the the percentage of babies being born in 75, a neo-Malthusian theory going back to 1770 theories. Someone who had written something saying that the growth of population was exponential, while the availability of resources was mathematical. That meant that many people would have died because of starvation. Many people fall in love with this concept. And who are the people enjoying this concept? Those who do not acknowledge the dignity of humans, those who think that humans are just intelligent animals and nothing more than that. I'm sorry, I do not have a marker with me. So from 1950 to 1970, the world population is the red line. The blue line is the rich countries' population, rich countries then were divided in Western countries, the economic triad, the United States, Canada, Japan, and Europe, and then there were the countries beyond the curtain wall, and then the poor countries. This is the triad. It is the wall, the whole country between the 50s and the 70s. It grows from 2.5 billion to 4 billion in 1970, so we had 4 billion people, half of them living in rich countries, and the rest living in developing countries or poor countries. Since 1973-74, more or less, the population living in rich countries slowed down and stopped. This is connected to the neo-Malthusian theory. And in 1968, at Stanford University, the rector of this university, Professor Ehrlich, underwent a public sterilization. What were these theories saying? They were saying that this was the pace, the rate of growth of the population all over the world. Before the year 2000, hundreds of millions of people would have died because of starvation. Some years after 1972-73, another important university in the United States, the MIT, published a set of books in Italy sponsored by the Club of Rome called The Limitation of Development and Advances, that stated things which were similar to what Ehrlich said. They spoke about dozens of millions of people that would have starved, especially in Asia, had the population growth trend not been stopped. Giulio Verne got it much righter than the economists, because not just did all these people not die, but hundreds of thousands of people just in Asia got richer and richer. Those who are getting poorer and poorer is us in the Western world. So we're going down to zero in 1985. The rest of the world, they were not reading these books. They kept making children, having children. In 2000, and there's a mistake, says the speaker on the slide. Well, more or less, in 2010, we are 6.5 million people, 4.5 billion people is not poor. The rest is. Africa can become rich if they're included in the globalization cycle. And I could explain this if we had more time. I'd like now, to provide a sort of contribution for reflection, a sort of food for thought. I'm not here to explain anything, so let's forget about the baby boomers. Let's have a look at the second graph, the second picture. I'm including this for a very simple reason. I'd like to explain to you the phenomenon the United States had to undergo because of military expenses. Many of us wonder how come that the speeding up of acceleration of the subprime to keep GDP up forgot what the role of the United States was. These are the years. Military expenses by the United States on the US GDP. We have three different times or stages we must never forget about the Americans. During the Cold War, after the Cold War period in 2001, the restarting of terrorism. This is the weight. This is the weight of the military expenses budget on the which was 14% on the GDP, collapses to 4% after the collapse, the fall of the Berlin Wall, then it goes up to 4.5%, and it goes really up to 20-25% every year after the Twin Tower attacks. So my remarks are the following one. A country like the United States, even though there was a slight population increase, especially coming from the Latin America world, why did the United States have to keep their GDP? Because they were increasing the military expenses. This is the very moment where the globalization started. From missiles to the market, this was the jargon used then. Well, this is just to give you a quick overview. When the Western world started slowing down with the birth of people, there was a slowing down of GDP in Western countries. This is what is scary for the world. So zero growth. What is the impact from this population? So if we say 100 million, 100 years after is the same, but the conception of that is completely different. So 10 years ago, 100 million was made up of 25% of people below 30 years of age, 35% of people between 30 and 55 years of age, and above 25% for those above 60 years of age. 10 years after that, those who are younger than 30 years of age account for 15%. Those who are in the mature age between 30 and 60 years of age go down to about 30%. There is an increase of 35% for people above 60 years of age. So it is still 100 million people, but the socioeconomic structure has been changed, has changed. This is the increase in fixed costs. If a population does not grow but stays the same, I mean, there's a replacement rate, which is 2 children for each couple, for each family. This is the replacement rate. For you to have a growth population, you need to have 2 children something, not just 2 children, but slightly more than 2 children. Otherwise, it's just a replacement rate among couples. So this concept is very important. We're not speaking about population growth. If there is no population growth, there is an increase in fixed costs because that is included in the productive cycle. We have more pensions, more health care to provide. That's why taxes could never decrease. Each government promises to decrease tax rates. Fixed costs are on the increase. You can see the straight line from 1980, it keeps growing, and those are the fixed costs I'm referring to. You need to increase taxes to compensate for that. In Italy, in 1980, Italian taxes were 25%, in 1990, 35%, and now we've got up to 52, 53. The effect of growth on GDP means less savings, less something else. There is another important phenomenon. If there are no new children born, the families generate savings. If you look at the red line going down, is the growth rate in decrease of the produced or yielded saving. If there is no growth, there is an interruption of the saving. There is less savings available, less financial assets available for the system. You need to increase, and to increase and sustain growth, there are less available assets. That's why sub-products are invented, derived products are invented. So the phenomenon of no birth does not equal to well-being. Some people think that if they do not have children, their well-being would increase. Maybe in the short term this is true, but in the medium term this is a collapse, because a social system in this way is more expensive. There is less savings, less financial assets would be available, and there is an increase with taxes, of course. Second point, second item, before crisis is something we've just seen. Let's see during the period through the economic crisis, which is the period where trying to compensate, to offset the collapse of GDP connected to the collapse of births. I'd like to use an example. I see there are so many young people who do not know what a GDP is. Let's take an ordinary family, mother, father, and children. The father earns 100. The children go to university. The family needs more income. So what does the real breadwinner do? Well, they work extra hours. They can work more, or they can steal. They can work extra time, extra hours, overtime. Well, so I earn 100, I work overtime, and I get to 105 as a wage. In the global world, what is the overtime for a family? It's productivity. Since the 80s onwards, there's been a speeding up in productivity. Productivity means that 1 hour labor force produces more added value. You need to invest in technology, but investments in technology decrease the need for more labor force. A capital-intensive area decreases the labor-intensive area. In the long run, this means that there is an increase in production, but there's less need of a stiff cost in production, which is labor force. So let's go back to the family. This is not enough. This is what the mother says. 5% more is not enough for our income to run the family. So the father or the husband says, let's try and save some money. Don't go to expensive shops and go to cheaper shops. I'm speaking about offshoring, the shifting of purchasing power, because productions, high-volume productions, have enabled the Western world to gain advantage from labor force in other countries, such as in Asia, by helping them improve goods, import goods, which costed half the price that would cost in the Western world. Because that enabled to buy goods which had much less cost than the cost that would have in Western countries. So this was implemented without any productive strategy in the medium and long term, because we've transferred the area of production. We were not good at providing competitiveness to systems that had to choose between being low cost or high productive technology, and there was no investment there, or having single products or items. We have high costs and have not invested in technology, and we do not even have single unique products. Then the third solution, which is what created a sort of tragedy on the top of that, I'm going to explain that by using the same family. So the mother is complaining. The mother says that they need to get some loans. So if I have some debts, I increase the GDP. If I take 20, I can get the 20 out of the 100, but I will have to pay that 20 one day in the future. And this is the crucial point of economy of the past 15 years, the Western world economy, which has been developing with the consumer debts. I'm going to show you to you with some graphs. This is the American family. The debt on GDP was 68%. In 2008, it got up to 96%. So American families got debts consumed and had the GDP increase of 28 points in 15 years, 2.8 points per year. On a net forecast growth, all this was coming from family debts, who become subsidiaries for the government growth itself. This is the U.S. family at the moment. This is the Italian debt system. In 98, the debt of the system. Let's forget about the public debt. When we speak about debt, we're not speaking about public debts only. We're speaking about bank debts, industry debt, family debts. In 98, it was to 100% of the Italian GDP. Now it has gone up to 300%, so it has increased enormously. This is blocking any possible healthy intervention on the Western economy. I'm going to skip some slides because it's late, says the speaker. So what can we do? What are the solutions? I'm sorry, I had to skip some important steps. Vittadini is not allowing me to speak any longer. There's nothing I can do, I'm sorry. So, how can deflate the 50% of the system? There are four important items. First one is default, not paying debts. But then you lose reliability. Then new bubbles, housing, real estate. Well, in the United States, this did not work, so I don't think it's going to work in Italy. Then inflation is there. Inflation is an evil which destroys. Many politicians think about this. It's been used twice in Italy to deflate debts, to decrease debts. Well, if it is true that in 10 years the debts of the system have increased by 50%, where is this money? Where is this liquidity? How come inflation did not start off? Well, because inflation is generated by a ratio. Monetary mass on available assets. Monetary mass times currency speed. Currency speed is 0. It is not circulating, because if it circulated, the inflation would go through the roofs. Well, the risk has increased, and if banks worked as intermediaries, well, inflation would go through the roof. Austerity. Final item, it means to tighten your belt. This is austerity, which is what we should have done 30 years ago. If we decide to have less children, this is possible, but you need to tighten your belt. We wouldn't have resources for pensions, and you produce less GDP, you invest less in technology and research. If taxes grow, investments decrease dramatically, you decide to help less poor countries because there's less availability. There would be less budgets for some temporary problems. So 1% growth of GDP means doubling GDP in 80 years. 8% growth means doubling the GDP in 8 years. Asia grows of 14%. Our growth equals 0. From geopolitical viewpoint, what is going to happen in 1989? An important bank, Goldman Sachs, carried out a survey for the United States, and they showed that had the United States not speeded up the growth of the GDP before 2020, Asia would have had 20% more economic power around the world. Well, these two entailed the need after the period after the economic crisis is something I'm not going to deal with because I'm going to bore you. So what should do Italy now to gain a stronger role within the world and global economy? Well, I could speak as a dreamer or as a politician that could be encouraging, but it will be too long. Thank you.
Dopo questo quadro molto originale, ammettiamolo, della
After this picture of the crisis, which is quite a peculiar one, the floor to Phillip Blond.
Thank you very much. I apologize. My Italian isn't good enough to inflict upon you. When we're talking about creating the conditions for a new economy, we have to analyze what went wrong with the old economy. And if I can put it very simply, both left and right destroyed relationship. And relationship is the basis and foundation of wealth. And the destruction of relationship is the destruction of wealth. So what I want to, broadly speaking, is outline for you how the left and the right are essentially the same insofar as they both conspire against the individual in relationship, which is the true condition of human life. And then I want to suggest to you that a new economy will be an economy of relationship. And I want to suggest to you that Christianity has always thought that the economy should be run on the basis of relationship. And that paradoxically, what we're seeing is the collapse of certain secular models of wealth and of economics, and the possible rise of an effective Christian political economy that really could change everything. Okay, so, fairly broad stuff. Largely speaking, since 1945, at least in my country, in the United Kingdom, and then in the last 10 to 15 years in Europe as well, there have been two competing ideologies. And everybody's been told those ideologies are different. And everybody said those ideologies are opposed. And those ideologies are on the left, collectivism, whose proxy is the state. On the right, it's the market, which is the carrier of individualism. So almost all human beings in Europe, if they're interested in politics, put themselves in one of these two camps. And depending how enthusiastic they are or ideological, they hate and despise those in the other camp. But this is bizarre, because the outcome of both left and right is exactly the same. What is that outcome? Massive economic centralization. Wealth has concentrated. More and more people have less and less. Under the guise of trickle-down economics, wealth has been sucked up into the top 10%, the top 1%, and the top 1% of the top 1%. In order to help the poor, the left invented something disastrous called the welfare state. The welfare state was meant to help the poor, was meant to stop poverty, was meant to provide a trampoline to bounce people out of need back into prosperity, hope, and aspiration. And all the taxes you pay, the billions and billions of euros and pounds, go apparently to help the poor. And yet the model of welfare hasn't helped the poor. The most obvious reason is there are still so many poor people. You would have thought that after 40 years of pumping money in to the welfare system, somebody would have thought, why do we still have poor people? And the problem is that both left and right essentially are two sides of the same coin. And that same coin is the centralization of power in the state and the centralization of wealth in the market. Now, you can see the consequences of this throughout the developed world. Globalization, which was meant to bring mass prosperity, has instead brought mass prosperity for many in the developing world, but increasing poverty and insecurity for those in the developed world. For instance, a single earning householder in the US, skilled worker, earned more in 1973 after adjusting for inflation than they did in 2007. And this creeping rise of economic insecurity and the centralization of wealth go hand in hand. And the more the market concentrates wealth, and the more it strips capital and ownership and independence from ordinary people, the more it forces them into welfare. Let me give you an example from the United Kingdom. In 1976, the bottom half of the population in the United Kingdom had 12% of the liquid wealth, 12% of the available capital. In 2007, the bottom half, the bottom 50% of the population had just 1% of the available capital. So those who have very little, even that has been taken from them. Now, Catholicism, particularly English Catholicism, and I'm thinking here of Chesterton and Belloc, had always named this. Concentration of wealth and welfare walk hand in hand. It's the new modern serfdom. We are recreating for our people the conditions of serfdom that first existed in the early Middle Ages. Now, it's even more perverse and more corrupt than that. Let me give you an example. Why is investment banking so profitable? And the ordinary economic activities that many of us live by produces so much less. One of the main reasons is that the state, on the basis of your taxes, provides a corporate welfare for the banks that essentially underwrites investment banking activity such that the banks carry no risk. Let me give you an example. In the United Kingdom, public sector, the liability to the banks was at 50% of GDP from about 1900 to the early 1970s. So the banks underwrote, the state, underwrote banking activity by 50% of GDP. By 2007, in just 30 years, that had risen tenfold. The British state now underwrites banking activity by 5 times GDP. So what the state has done is created a welfare that traps people in poverty for ordinary people and created an asset welfare for the very rich that ensures that they become ever more wealthy. So what are we to do? What we need is not only a subsidiarity of the state, but we need a subsidiarity of the market. And what is the lowest level of subsidiarity, and therefore the highest form of life? It is you and I. It is the relationship between human beings. And what we have to do is invert our state and our market. We have to undermine collectivism and individualism because they're both the same, and replace it with a politics and economics of human relationality. For instance, we have to start lending money to each other. We have to capture the capital that's locked in the highest levels of society, stop underwriting it, so that we can price back in local investment activity. In the United States and in the UK, a person-to-person banking service where we lend face-to-face to each other is offering rates of return that are higher for the lender and rates of interest that are lower for the person being lent to. If we can create the conditions for bottom-up prosperity, if we can use mutualization and association and the economics around that, we need never have poverty again. What we need to do for the poor is move up their supply chains, both public and private. Creating bottom-up associations that take back market share from the monopolies that never pay any taxes anyway, so that the poor can start providing their own services to themselves. This is what I call asset welfare. So instead of welfare keeping people on a subsistence level, you use welfare to enable people to reverse takeover from the bottom the public and private services they already use. And if the poor are no longer poor, if we have broken with dependency, then your state doesn't need so many taxes. And if you are taxed less, you can invest more. That is the new economics. The new economics of relationship realizes that if your brother were to fail, it is far worse for you economically and socially than if your brother or sister were to succeed. The 20th century has been a century of sectional interest. That's why we have the division between left and right. That's why we have the fragmentations in our society. The 21st century will be, if it's a good century, the century of mutuality, of relationship. And that is a Christian political economy. Thank you.
Buongiorno a tutti, grazie Giorgio e a tutti gli amici per...
Thank you very much, Giorgio and all the other friends for inviting me. I've been paying attention to the speakers before me, and with you I'd like to quickly go through some of the reasons that have triggered the financial crisis we've been suffering from since August 2007, and it's not over yet in spite of what we read in newspapers. Sometimes we write interesting things, sometimes we write things that can be criticized. Many other mistakes that have triggered the financial crisis and has Mr. Tedeschi has clearly defined before, it has been shifting from private debt to public debt. And we are not aware what is going to happen in the future. Why that? We've seen that in one of the graphs Mr. Tedeschi has shown, because the inflation indicator in economy is not suggesting anything. This indicator is not there. But many things are happening under the surface of economy. Maybe it should be the task of journalists and economists to understand what is happening below the surface of economy, so that those who are there that need to be taking decisions can act in a timely manner. So what was the fundamental, the worst mistake? The worst mistake was to think that the market could never fail. And at this point, self-criticism is necessary. And I'm doing it on a personal basis too. For years we thought that the market could be a self-regulatory system, could be a self-amending system, it could be a self-correcting system. It is not so. The market is the best tool to guarantee trade with correctness and with merits, but it is not just as much effective in correcting balances. Instead, over the past years, it has even worsened the imbalances. Why did this all happen? For four reasons, in my opinion. Financial tools developed in a geometrical manner. This because what Ettore, Gotti, Tedeschi said before, there was also the change in liquidity, which was the source of some globalized economies, especially the Asian ones. U.S. financial regulation in the mid-90s, and then that encouraged the supply of sophisticated and risky products. At this point, a bitter American truth must be stated. Those that made the regulation possible, which was at the basis of the following financial crisis, are the ones who are working on the most important powers of the U.S. leverages. Then the supply of products we defined as toxic did not disappear all at once. We called them toxic securities. They're still toxic, but it's a pity very few people speak about them. Then the loss of the perception of risk. This was triggered by the segmentation of debts and the diffusion, the widespreading of products that created a bad relationship between a creditor and debtor, while in the normal system everyone knows who owns to whom, while that type of relationship changed, and the leverage, which is the ratio between what I have and what I can borrow, has been completely changed. The third reason is embedded in the paradox of information globalization, and this is closer to things I do on a daily basis. I think this is, however, an important topic. All of us know about what happens all over the world. This is the sensation citizens have vis-à-vis information globalization. I mean, the globalization of information. We know things in real time. For instance, I'm speaking about the progressive loss of having public opinion in some authoritarian regimes in some countries, but all this leads to some confidence in those experts in economy that then at the same time leads them to also underestimate some risks. For instance, an excess of confidence of the protagonists of these markets. Sometimes they get so much money too, they underestimate some signals. They believe more maybe in their personal powers than in the objective, real deeds and facts which are happening in front of their eyes. This is what happens with globalization. Something happens in front of my eyes, but I do not believe in that because I'm so stubborn, determined with my ideas that things must occur as I think. AIG, an insurance company, realized. We're speaking about the largest insurance company in the world that can assess their own risks, their clients' risks. One Sunday they discovered, speaking about autumn 2 years ago, that they're going to fail 3 days after, hadn't anybody ever realized that the insurance company was going to go bankrupt in a very short time? Well, therefore we have loss of contact with the daily reality of labor and employment, with the despise of people, even for those who are going away, from offices where they had been made redundant. Then a dramatic fall of decency, because if markets are collapsing and society is risking a lot, and if a company buys something very expensive, as for instance a dustbin for the office, well, they're not taking care of what they should be taking care. I mean, they are shallow and they just focus on superficial things. This means the stubbornness of power, being greedy, have prevailed. And the market which even I myself thought was not possible to fail, actually failed. And the fourth reason is the most important reason, is that there is not such a thing as a market without rules, and we do agree with this, but there is not a real market without a widespread, disseminated ethics. I'm not just speaking about social ethics, I'm also speaking about personal ethics. I'm speaking about a moral personality of the just profit, which you need for growth and also for the assessment of our work, of our labor. That means that religious freedom is something I must respect. As an open market, it is something I want to imitate on the market. I mean, I'm not surprised if there are things that are done that would be really something which I would not normally do, because when you are in dire straits, you actually do not understand what you have, what is right and what is wrong. Bernard de Mandeville fables of the bees is a very nice fable written in verses. Ian Keynes referred to this fable. They had different opinions, but they both refer to these fables. So there can be a collective advantage you can get if all the people in the honey, of the animals living in the honeycomb, have the opportunity to invest and to get rich. But the honeycomb is the country, is the nation, but it was betrayed by speculators. Not even the moral sanction was paid for. Those who paid with the risk did not fail because of the government contribution, the money coming from the public sector, and started feeding themselves as they were doing before. Because another paradox we experienced is that public money was used in some cases, and some people started again on the road using public money. Therefore, it is true that St. Thomas said that if all sins were not made, useful things sometimes would not be made. But we must think also about the common interest, common good, public ethics and personal ethics have been lost. But what is important is that those who wanted to become really rich did that by despising their neighbor and by making important things invisible, despising their neighbor. And this is a consideration I usually make also when I'm speaking just about Italy. Well, those who despise their neighbors sometimes think that that is a way of showing their power. Unlike being Catholic, I mean, some people think that if they are arrogant with the others, they think they are showing themselves to other people as being strong. If they are kind and if they have good manners, they think that the others may think that they are weak. Gotti Tedeschi has written an interesting book. A new edition is about to be published. They spoke about the new governance. You know that in economy there is a Christian law by which the bad currency destroys the good currency, but the bad conscience has even crashed the good conscience. At the meeting over the past years, we've been making reference to the preachings of the social doctrine from the church and by the church. In the book by Gotti, there is a reference to John Paul II and also to the encyclical Caritas Caritate. Well, beyond all these reflections, there is an attempt, and maybe the message that has to be conveyed and has to be spoken up is the dignity is the focusing on substantial rights. Also, we reference some agreement rules, and Marchione underlined this aspect. Sometimes you protect too much those who have a job, and you pretend you do not see those who do not have a job. This is the challenge of growth. Without that, there won't be any employment for the youth. Growth is not a priority in our country. I hope it is a priority in Philip's country, in the United Kingdom. But growth is not a priority for Italy, I'm sorry. There are other priorities which are just as much important: justice, the legal system, federalism. Well, but if growth were the real priority, and growth means employment for the youth, respect for the family, we wouldn't be appalled by those who curb growth. But this is not happening. We should, for instance, give up speaking about the labor market as if we were speaking about any other labor market. In the exhibition, there's an interesting sequence. The labor market, for some of us, is the functioning of any other labor market, as if labor was a commodity. Maybe we shouldn't be referring to them as human resources, and maybe call them just people, so that we could have more respect for their work. I'm saying this as a sort of self-criticism. We should speak less about supply and demand of labor. We should speak more about investment in training human capital, knowledge, culture. It's not a question of costs. It's not a question of costs anymore, as it has been underlined yesterday. We should get out of the logic of accounting of labor. It is not even so in other logics. Flexibility is not always a value. I think flexibility is a value on the way in and on the way out. But if the work is flexible also within the culture of the company they belong to, citizenship is not developed, but just a big movement of professions which creates a wrong value and solitude, loneliness.
Allora ci deve essere flessibilità in entrata e in uscita e nel nostro.
So we need a good balance for this, and there is no balance in our country. So good flexibility, but we need to invest more in knowledge. And Phillip, you are absolutely right when you say that the economy of future is made up of relationships among people. And often in many companies, in many firms, even in mine, we do not take care of relationships among people. And then we need to give value again to manual work. Material labor plays an extraordinary function, not just a productive one. Artisanal work, craftsmanship, pedagogy, visibility and social dignity to material work, labor, because in this way you can make a new shift to give a sense of roots and traditions to communities which are often disrupted by globalization. Manual labor must regain an important place within society. Sometimes when we think about the choices for our children, we think about their future as an intellectual job for them, while there are many other important job opportunities which are not just the intellectual jobs. Then today, after the illusion of the 60s, we are realizing so many things. Contemporary society, as it is described oftentimes on TV, is a society that does not work, that does not provide jobs, and doesn't even take care or can't even be bothered to find employment for the people that make up society. It's just like a soap opera where everything is very easy and where there are many shortcuts to get to success. There's another factor which is important. Well, without social mobility, labor is something limited where it is difficult to dream. Social mobility was much higher in the past century. Today it is crushed by limited opportunities, and there are those who have a lot of opportunities, but there are many who do not have any opportunities. Social mobility must be restructured, rebuilt, because our country is locked up, is chained. The ratio between sacrifice and results, anything can be achieved if you are willing, if you have the skill, but to get to that purpose you need to study, you need to work hard. There's no shortcut. There is no paving the way to getting easily to your target. So if a financial intervention can be a risk, well, if there are risks at financial level. There's something that does not work in our society, and with some think that the financial system can generate income. The financial system is at the service of production but cannot generate income. We are going through a time when our society, in spite of all the good qualities, the countless examples of solidarity, of production clusters and all the positive things that have been emerging even in these days through the meeting, sometimes the society is not generating that mobility, and there are those societies that because they are selfish, they have less children, they think about their pension, and they do not take care of what is going to happen to future generations. If our fathers, if our grandfathers, when our country was destroyed by the war, had been thinking like we are doing now, we wouldn't be here today speaking about these things today.
Mi chiede Gotti Tedeschi 30 secondi finali.
Domanda Ferruccio de Bortoli.
So a question for Ferruccio de Bortoli. If all this happens, so man has lost individual ethics, does not have the sense of common good, has lost the sense of life and their own action. Ferruccio de Bortoli is wondering, there's something wrong that does not work. What is wrong? Well, over the past 30 years, priests have not been teaching anymore. They have not been teaching any doctrine anymore. The economic crisis is generated by something that could be summed up as follows. The economy and the instruments that should be the instruments for a purpose have had a moral autonomy. Read the encyclical, please. Ferruccio de Bortoli went through introduction written by Benedict XVI, speaking about a dominating nihilism today. And if those who get out of the crisis will be those who have good priests, who will start again teaching the doctrine again. They will have those competitive advantages that will make a civilization strong, mature, aware, that makes a distinction between purposes and tools. Don Kamisaska said that. He said that in his latest book. He said just this. Those who teach to give a sense to life, to one's own action. I'm speaking about the preaching and teaching to politicians, to bankers. They have not learned what the essential values are. Giving meaning to life. Those who win the winners will be those who will have priests teaching the doctrine.
Gli applausi che abbiamo riportato mostrano il consenso che abbiamo avuto.
I think this is summing up, is mirroring what we've been dealing with throughout the meeting in these days. We heard some different phases of the same issue. We heard about birth rates, the welfare state, which decreases the opportunity to help the poor and increases the gaps. Then the explanation by Ferruccio concerning the different stages of the crisis. All these aspects refer to the topics we've been trying to deal with in these days. Economic rationality. The idea of economic rationality, as Ferruccio was saying and Ettore was saying before, is the idea of the highest individual profit that through the invisible hand leads to the collective well-being. We are for profit. However, this is an aspect of rationality. The individual profit of collective well-being has to be managed by a wider rationality approach. Thinking about your neighbor, providing jobs, creating jobs, setting up a company, a strong company, appreciating the beauty of this, of reality connected with the interest. My personal enjoyment, my well-being, which is shared with the others. The idea of creating a civil life, shared good. All this is rationality. Desire is the keyword for the meeting. And as Ferruccio was saying, the openness to common reflection, starting from Catholicism, but being compared with the lay world for a new way of being social. Don Giussani was saying desire is like a spark which is needed to start off an engine. Everything starts from this dynamic. The desire starts up the engine of humans. A man looks for a woman, for a job, for a comfortable armchair. It is expansion, it is dilation coming from these stimulations. All this is generated by what the Bible calls the heart. This heart paves the way also for a new vision of economy.